My name is Aska Hisa, and I am the Director of Learning and Engagement at ICALA. This program is in conjunction with Jamal Cyrus, The End of My Beginning, an exhibition of over 50 works by Houston-based artist Jamal Cyrus. Cyrus has a multidisciplinary practice that examines the evolution of African American identity within Black political movements and the African diaspora. Cyrus's sensitivity to cross-cultural pollination and movements through history take us back to ancient Egypt, the 16th century transatlantic slave trade, the Jazz Age, and the 60s civil rights movement. And he does this with poetic object making that involves a wide-ranging aesthetic use of materials. These materials can be organic shells and seaweed, papyrus, record albums, to denim and African kente cloth. Reflections on the Black experience are also shared through a personal interest in music, particularly around the beauty and resonance of record shops and instruments. The exhibition spans 16 years of Cyrus's career and follows a trajectory of the artist's practice that both commemorates and provides inquiry into historic inflection points, currents of hybridity, and the affirmation of African American identity. This evening, we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Bilal Butch Ware, historian of Africa and Islam, and associate professor in the Department of History at UC Santa Barbara. And he will provide perspectives and context for the work of Jamal Cyrus and other Black cultural figures who anchor themselves in the artistic to transcend struggle and powerfully persevere in the visual, the soulfully sonic, and the spiritual. So a little bit more about our speaker. Dr. Bilal Ware is Associate Professor, Department of History at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research spans the last 1,000 years, centering on West Africa while reaching into the Mediterranean lands of Islam and the Atlantic worlds of the African diaspora. Prior to UCSB, Dr. Ware has taught at University of Michigan and Northwestern University. His work aims to confront and dispel Western misconception about Islam. He received his PhD in history from the University of Pennsylvania. Jamal Cyrus, The End of My Beginning, is accompanied by a fully illustrated color catalog, which you can buy here. The exhibition originated at the Blaffer Art Museum, at the University of Houston, and was curated by Stephen Maticio, Jane Dale Owen Director and Chief Curator at the Blaffer. This show's organizing curator for Los Angeles, which is the artist's first presentation here. It was organized by Jamila James, former senior curator of ICALA, and Caroline Ellen Liu, curatorial assistant. Thank you all for coming.
Greetings of peace and blessings to everybody who made it out this evening for this intimate discussion of Jamal Cyrus's art and the broader context to situate it. I'm just gonna let you know off the top that I was raised in a Black rhetorical tradition that prizes call and response. I'm not gonna sit here and talk at you for the next 45 minutes. I will periodically ask you questions, and they're not rhetorical, so I'll ask you guys to get engaged and jump into the conversation. And if you have a question as we move through, we'll have time at the end, but you can also, if there's something pressing, don't hesitate to raise a hand. So let's go ahead and begin. So the title, after some reflection that I settled upon for this lecture, was Black and Blues People, Africana Art, Spirituality, and Struggle. It was a title that made a lot of sense to me, having sat with the works of Jamal Cyrus for a little over 2 years now. Jamal and I have not met in person. We met during COVID. Interestingly enough, he was one of a small group of people that was joining a trip a company that I was going to take to Senegal, essentially a roots tour that involved various artists, scholars, academics, and other folks right before COVID hit, so that trip didn't happen. We connected and actually corresponded regularly during the time of COVID, which we're obviously still in, but 2020 and 2021. We had hoped Jamal would be here for this evening. That wasn't in the cards due to a difficulty with a previous commitment, but he's here in spirit. So I chose this particular title having seen over an extensive period and dialogued over a fair amount of time with this artist himself, the meanings of some of the works that he was engaging. So the title, Black and Blues People. 50 years ago, Amiri Baraka wrote a classic work, a now classic work, of African-American literature critique, literary critique, sociology, social theory, entitled Blues People. Y'all know about this work, Blues People? Okay. Really, really powerful, moving analysis, penetrating analysis. Baraka himself wasn't born with this very Muslim-sounding name, Amiri Baraka. He was born as LeRoi Jones. This is a name that he chose for himself. And one of the themes that we're going to talk through in this evening's discussion is the relationship between Blackness and Islam that is at the root of Jamal Cyrus's artistic engagement. As an African-American Muslim himself, Islam is bursting through the seams of many of the pieces back there, but in subtle, powerful. The word that I would say is that they're not. It's not a proselytizing engagement. He's not preaching to you or trying to convert you. He's bringing something to life through the work. So, in Baraka's classic work, Blues People, he makes this argument about how we ought to understand the emergence of a specifically Black artistic sensibility within the realm of music, something that flows from African wellsprings, but becomes its own distinctive artistic tradition under the circumstances of American oppression. And for him, blues is the signature musical form to give expression to this. It speaks to a deeply felt and thoroughly embodied pain that reaches down into the soul and has to come out in musical form. This brilliant book, Blues People, has become a sort of standard text in lots of Black studies departments, literature departments, and so forth. When I sat with the works of Jamal Cyrus, I became thoroughly convinced that we need exactly the kind of critical engagement with Jamal Cyrus's work that we've taken on with Amiri Baraka's, that it's that powerful, that it's that foundational, but it's in a distinctly different register. It's not in the words of a poet, it's not in the words of a writer, it is in a multidisciplinary visual expression. And there is power, quite literally, in the objects that Jamal Cyrus has arranged for us to reflect upon. So, one other quick connection between Baraka and Cyrus, aside from the kind of Black cultural nationalism and Islamic elements which inform both their works. Both were deeply shaped by the assassination of Malcolm X. Okay. In 1965, after the assassination of Malcolm, Baraka quite controversially literally left the white woman he was married to, moved to Harlem, and essentially became one of a handful of founding members of what ultimately becomes called the Black Arts Movement, which parallels in many ways in the artistic world what the Black Power movement means in the political world in the late 1960s. The engagement with what Malcolm meant and what his death meant is literally at the center of what Jamal Cyrus does in the exhibit behind us. If you haven't yet been back through there, spend as much time as you can with the centerpiece, Lights from the Garden. Lights from the Garden is anything that I could say in words will be reductive, but it would be disrespectful not to attempt to use words. So what Lights from the Garden is it is a collection of the same kinds of chairs that were in the Audubon Ballroom where Malcolm was assassinated. Chairs that you can see strewn about the room in the chaos in the moments after this man had dozens of bullets fired into and around his body. Jamal has taken the chairs of the Audubon Ballroom and arranged them into a minbar, the place where a Muslim preacher stands to deliver the Friday sermon. And holding together this minbar are a series of rods meant to represent the trace, the ballistic rods of those bullets as they pierced through the air that afternoon in 1965. Incredibly powerful for everyone that I know that has seen it, even over Zoom. Standing next to it was quite a different matter. Malcolm is present throughout this work. You'll find also, again, the scale didn't come through over Zoom, but this incredible piece where he's taken the cover page of Malcolm X's FBI surveillance file and blotted out all of the writing except for the name M. Little, Malcolm's birth name, with an X across the top. So there is a deep and powerful engagement with Malcolm and his legacies that is tying together Baraka and Cyrus, and we'll come back to that image of Malcolm. Cyrus's art is also visually evocative of the musical and cultural landscape that shaped people like Amiri Baraka. As soon as you go back into that room, you'll start to travel back in time to a kind of golden age of Black cultural nationalism, right? A beautiful piece, padded vest with all sorts of Africana classics, including the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I'm forgetting which work by Amiri Baraka. It's not Blues People, but another Baraka work, almost to create a kind of bulletproof vest of Africana knowledge through which one can negotiate the world. So what Jamal is doing is exploring through multidisciplinary visual installations a kind of unspoken register of meaning. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. However, the biggest point of departure, I would say, in the comparison between Blues People and the work of Jamal Cyrus has to do with its musical framing. While Cyrus' exhibit is evocative of that kind of golden age of Black cultural nationalism, the musical influence isn't blues, it's not jazz. The musical influence that is running through the works of Jamal Cyrus is hip hop. It's in the naming of the pieces, and it's in the arrangements of the visual items. And I'll say what I mean more directly as we get further into the talk. So what I'm going to try to provide with the time that remains is some relevant context as a historian of Africa, African America, and Islamic culture. I'm going to give us some context to help center the sacred struggle that Jamal Cyrus is representing visually with his art. So to keep this simple, you only have to remember the three things in the subtitle to frame the entirety of this talk. So what were the three things in the subtitle? I told y'all I was going to ask you questions. Black and Blues People. Can anybody picture the flyer in their mind? Oscar, you have to be able to do this. See? Yeah, spirituality was one of them, absolutely. Africana art, yes, and struggle. Okay, perfect. So we just need these three terms, hang them above your head, suspend them in the air, and we're going to move through them in reverse order from the way that they appeared on the flyer, because I don't do anything in order. So if I'm not mistaken, it was Africana art, spirituality, and struggle. So we'll start with struggle, move to spirituality, and we'll come back to where we started with the art, okay? So first, the struggle. As Oscar mentioned, the pieces arranged, over 50 pieces. I think the end of my beginning is a sort of way that Mr. Cyrus is marking a kind of midpoint in his productive work. So it's where he's come so far, right? These 50 pieces. There is a story that is being told that is about struggle, a story that's being told about history. And as Oscar mentioned, some of those pieces reference back to ancient Egypt, right? In the shadow, the obelisk, the engagement with Pharaoh. Some of this mediated through X-Clan lyrics, a piece back there entitled Grand Verbalizer, What Time Is It? For those of you who are fans of late 80s hip hop, these are all references to the kind of nihilocentrism of the late 1980s Afrocentric movement, this call back to Egypt. So as the original point of departure for all of the cultural efflorescences that infuse the Black past. For sure, you'll see directly the engagement with the trauma of slavery. And West Africa is prominent in the pieces, representing the region of origin for roughly 75 to 80% of the enslaved people that were brought into bondage in the New World. So let's talk about that struggle as a historian. Between 12 and 20 million people between 1490 and 1888, when the last Western societies abolish the slave trade and the institution of slavery. The last two are Brazil in 1886 and Cuba in 1888, just a little over a century ago. Again, framing the Islamic infusion in Cyrus's work, it's important to note that between 10 and 15% of those enslaved Africans that were brought into bondage in the New World were of Muslim background. It doesn't sound like a big number until you realize that that is larger than any single national or ethnic contingent in the human beings that were sold into bondage. In other words, no particular country in Africa amounted to 10 or 15% of the population. No ethno-linguistic group amounted to 10 or 15% of the population. Muslims were a huge contingent overall in the cultural matter that becomes Black people in the New World. And this is a part of the story that is often forgotten in a day and age that tells stories about Blackness and Islam as though they don't have anything to do with one another, right? We think about Arabs in the Middle East when we think about Islam. We don't think about Africa. But there are more than 350 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa. 1 in 6 of the world's Muslims lives in Black Africa. There are more Muslims in Nigeria today than there are in Egypt. There's more Muslims in Ethiopia than there are in Iraq. Islam has been central to the story of Africa, and Africa has been central to the story of Islam. So Jamal is not engaged in mere play, nor reflexive self-exploration of his own personal identity. He's seeing the Islam bursting through the scenes of what it seems of what is Blackness. And that is something that is deeply historical, in point of fact. That trade, which brought untold millions into bondage, was of course only the beginning of the suffering. There's a deep engagement with the Middle Passage and the transformation from Africans to Black people that is present as Jamal goes back and forth between both registers at the same time, using African objects and those central to African American culture in single installations in order to try to tell a story that is out of time, right? Seeking to make whole that which was split, seeking to bring back together that which was rent asunder. As a historian, this is this is a quintessentially African-American approach to historical temporality. And what I mean by that is we never let time get in the way of telling a meaningful story. What Jamal is doing in juxtaposing different pieces is entirely comfortable in an African ontological and narrative mode. Tell the story the way that the story needs to be told. Don't let linear narratives stand in the way of expressing that which needs to be expressed. Don't let facts stand in the way of telling truths. So he is breaking through some of the walls in the past, even as he is erecting others. This 12 to 20 million person trade, as I said, was just the beginning of the struggle. We all know something about ongoing legacies of racial violence, political dispossession. Again, Jamal and I met literally, our first Zoom meeting, I think, was a week or two after George Floyd was murdered, right? Still grappling with the fundamental racial injustices that have defined the age, but not in a way that is mournful or sorrowful. Rather, and this is, again, back to that point of departure between blues and hip hop, but rather in one that is, productive, sometimes fierce, but also joyous and generative. And this is something that was expressed, and Baraka talked about this to a certain extent in Blues People, in the formulation of Black cultural expression in its historical sense. How many of y'all have heard of the ring shout? Nobody's heard of a ring shout? Ring shout, yeah. You mind sharing with us what a ring shout is?
Sure.
Wa alaikum salam. Oh, okay, yeah. There's something to that in it.
Yeah, but essentially a circle where folks are between dancing and praise and sort of antebellum.
Exactly, perfect. A space where people are in a circle, in a space between dancing and praise, usually associated with the antebellum period, the period before the abolition of slavery here in the United States of America. Couldn't have given a better description, and the Kaaba is not outside of that story. So, as a historian of African America, what can I tell you about the ring shout? The ring shout was this ceremony that enslaved people would have to practice in the woods under the cover of night, because African forms of religious expression and cultural expression were strongly controlled by slave-owning regimes. So this had to take place in secret. So people would go out to the woods, people that were drawn from all different parts of the African continent, right? 10 to 15% might have come from Muslim backgrounds. Perhaps 8 to 10% might have come from the Kingdom of Congo. Another 5 to 7% from the Kimbundu Kingdom just to the south of it. Some from what's now Nigeria or Benin or other places, speaking dozens and even hundreds of different languages, coming from hundreds of different cultural backgrounds and practicing a wide variety of distinctive religions. How were these people, coming from all of these different parts of the African continent, going to become a single people? How were they going to forge a common identity out of the diverse refuse of what was left of their lives after they were taken away from those lives in bondage? That then was the work of culture and spirituality, just as it is now behind us the work of culture and spirituality. The ring shout for the African Muslim, moving in its counterclockwise direction, would for him or her be tawaf, the circumambulation of the Kaaba, the circumambulation of the site where a holy man or woman might have been buried in their home villages. For someone that came from the Congo Kingdom, where Christianity was adopted by Congolese kings as early as the 15 teens, this was a kind of praise shout that had that had emerged in the fusion between traditional Congo religion and Christianity as it came to be celebrated. For the Fawn speaker from Benin, there were analogous practices. In other words, in countless African societies, there was something familiar in the ring shout. In this ceremony that emerged on plantations, there was a grammar that everyone understood that was beyond words. Because a lot of times they didn't have the words to talk to one another in. What came out had to come out through an embodied practice, not through words. It had to come out through a shared spiritual experience. And through that shared spiritual experience and that embodied practice, a new language was going to emerge. A new culture was going to emerge. People that had seen different things in the practice were actually forging a new practice by sharing it, even if the meanings were different. And this is the beauty of embodied practice, and this is the beauty of art. We're in the same space and we're sharing something, but the meanings that we're bringing and taking away are not necessarily identical, but through the shared experience, we are producing something new. The something new that was being produced in the ring shout was Black religion, as we came to know it. It was Black spirituality as we came to know it, something that ultimately gets associated with the Black church, because the Black church is the only visible form of religious expression that the slaveholding society will permit. However, the Black church is simply the framework for the expression of a uniquely African American religious sensibility that has been forged through collective effort, pulling together distinct pieces of the African past and the American experience to make a single coherent statement about who we are and what it is that counts as us. Blackness is a miracle, because never before in human history had people that were held together by nothing other than the color of their skin and the condition of their servitude ever become a cultural nation. The engagement with Black nationalism that you see in the works of Amiri Baraka, that you see in the works of Jamal Cyrus, this is a claim on the cultural work of ancestors that turned hundreds of different people into a single people. Whenever anyone tells you that race making is always bad, no. Blackness is a miracle. It had never happened before. Did the slaves of the Greeks become a people? Did the slaves of the Romans become a people? Did the slaves of the Arabs become a people? Never in human history had people that were held together under circumstances of bondage from so many different environments actually managed to form a nation. A culturally coherent entity with its own variegated but nonetheless clearly identifiable cultural logic. The struggle. What was the next one? Spirituality. And you can see that I already cheated because I used the ring shout. You see what I did there? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Not to divert that this is about Black history, because it absolutely is, but that just reminded me the ring shout seems to slightly like the ghost dance, which is that's my cultural reference, I'm native, but that's the same thing that being a pan-Indian sort of thing.
And it's an excellent interjection and intervention. Let's not forget that the making of what constitutes Blackness is not dissociable from nativeness. This is something that, so my listen, both of my grandmothers on my father's side are half Seminole. There has never been a space and time in which Black and Native were not mingled, nor was there, were there many places and times where the Native population was not also subjected to enslavement. And this is something that is widely forgotten. Even if you go into 18th century South Carolina, right, relatively recent past, you know, in historians' terms, 20% of the enslaved population in and around Charleston and its immediate hinterland were of Native origin. So this, and the tribal affiliation of my paternal kin, Seminole itself is a composite tribe that is composed largely of runaway Africans, right? It wasn't its own nation before it was this amalgamation nation. No alliteration nor rhyme intended. It just happened that way. So yes, it's an excellent point. And it's also just a reminder that there could be and were other metaphysics and practical meanings that were infusing that. And nativeness can never be drawn out of Blackness, even if it's sometimes subjugated within it. So thank you for the excellent interjection. And so Octavia Butler, you know, Tananarive Due, you know, there's a lot of, you know, sort of excellent exploration of this same kind of sensibility that has been expressed through, whether you call it, you know, kind of, you know, Black speculative fiction or supernatural fiction, but it plays along this lines. And actually that leads into where we're going next with spirituality, because there's a very distinct kind of metaphysics that's being expressed. So with y'all's permission, I'll move into that. I use the ring shout as the way of framing because the cultural work that goes into the production of Blackness, that goes into the construction of a distinct identity for a people that were brought together in bondage, largely takes place through religious practice. It takes place through spirituality. That is present very plainly and clearly in the ring shout, and that engagement is present in Jamal Cyrus's works. One of the places where you see this tradition expressed most clearly in his work is in a piece that he entitles just BPPGG. Okay, so B, 2 P's, 2 G's. All right, and it might not be immediately clear. I didn't read the caption back there to know whether the full explanation is present. But this is a leather jacket with talismans sewn into it, amulets of various kinds. The BPPGG stands for Black Panther Party Grigri. What, you may ask, is a grigri? Well, a grigri is a typical West African talismanic power object, okay? The original grigris, so these you'll often find, let's say if you go to, you know, Senegal today or really many parts of West Africa, you won't see them if people are fully clothed, but perhaps here around the bicep, top of the bicep, there'll be a string of leather with a leather pouch and something folded up inside of it. Perhaps others made out of silver, worn around the waist, hidden, concealed from view. These are power objects that are kept upon the body. These are widely described throughout the historical literature on enslaved Africans throughout the Americas. Jamal's engagement is diasporic in its scope. It's largely centered on African America, but it's diasporic in its scope. So I'll go to Brazil to provide the relevant context for these talismanic power objects. In the 1500s, these African power objects were identified as bolsa de mandinga, which means mandingo bags. because they were associated with the largest ethnic group that was being imported into Brazil in bondage in the 1500s, the Mandingo people of West Africa. Mandingo is not just the kind of boxing that you find in the movie Django. It's an actual reference to an ethnic group that were the framers of the largest political unit in West African history, the Empire of Mali. And the Mandingo people converted to Islam in their majority around 1000 or 1100 CE, about 1,000 years ago. So the predominant religion amongst the Mandingo has always, for lack of a better word, been Islam. But they've also continued to use these kinds of power objects, which people usually associate with African traditional religion and with a kind of pre-Islamic fetish, literally. What a Bolsa de Mandinga actually is usually verses from the Quran that are written, that have secret power, and that are then tethered to the body so that they will form a protection for the one that bears them. Oftentimes, these will be the last two verses of the Quran, verses that are known as the two protectors. And they will allow a person to move through the world without suffering harm. He's put inside his Black Panther Party perfect, Lawrence Fishburne, Matrix leather jacket, right? Sewn through with these power objects and sitting right across from the chairs of the Audubon Ballroom formed into a minbar, begging the question, could Malcolm have walked away that night if he had had the appropriate spiritual protection? Is there a way of shielding us from the harm that is coming our way? The Bolsa de Mandinga is actually still the term that is used for any power object in Brazil. Even those that come from non-Muslim regions in Africa, they can now be Vodun or voodoo items that come from the Bight of Benin. They can be power objects, Christian power objects that come from the Congo originally. But this basic framework for utilizing objects that channel some power from the unseen world in order to produce a result in the seen world, this runs through all African and Black cosmology. And that, to me, is what Jamal Cyrus is doing. Let me explain what I mean by that. My colleague at University of California, Santa Barbara, art historian, Sylvester Obechi, we've had this running conversation. I work on textual embodiment. My first book is called The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa. So I write about how human beings come to embody sacred texts, okay? Sylvester Obechi works on how African art objects always served ritual and spiritual purposes. So we're constantly having this conversation about how materiality and immateriality connect to one another. How Africans utilize interventions in the unseen world in order to produce results in the seen world, always by using some material object as the mediator between the two spaces. We ultimately reach the conclusion that we're talking about the same thing. It's just that I'm talking about how human beings serve this function. And him as an art historian, he is focused on how African objets d'art, African art objects, are mediating spaces between the metaphysical realm and the physical realm. They are power objects. Not just in the spiritual effect that they produce upon the human psyche and upon the human soul, but that they literally channel something that comes from a space that cannot be accessed with discourse, that cannot be accessed with words. And they bring it into the material social life which we all experience. They are a portal. They are a space in which the veil is lifted. Please. No, I almost thought you were going to get the Holy Spirit there for a minute. So you got
material that bridges the spiritual to this like consciousness.
Yes.
Consciousness. Can you talk about that? Like, I mean, that idea of like this veil that also.
Absolutely. So, and I'll do this. This is what I work on and write about. So I'll try to do this in a way that doesn't take the next 30 minutes. I'm going to try to be brief about this. Yeah. So she asked me to talk about this veil and this space where the line between the spiritual realm and the material realm becomes thin around these objects. So she wants more attention paid to the line between the unseen and the seen worlds, if I understood the question correctly. So, underlying all African metaphysical systems, whether Congolese Christianity, the Islam that is practiced throughout West Africa, or African traditional religions, is the idea that the world that we experience with our senses is a vanishing, perishable, illusory world. The world behind the veil of our senses is durable, lasting, true, and clear. The principal veil that obstructs our perception of that which lies beyond the realm of our senses is the dominance of our senses and the tyranny of our egos. And that through processes of spiritual purification and the utilization of the right mediating objects in the right ways, at the right times, one can pierce the veil between this fake world and that real one and see into it. And that what pours in from the unseen world into the seen world is the thing that is actually most powerful and capable of changing things in the seen world. If I were to call it something, I would call it the metaphysics of Black revolutionaries. The idea that once you tap into that durable, lasting spiritual truth, it changes the human matter that exists on the other side, and you become a different kind of instrument for effectuating change in the world. That there is always a relationship between ritual practice, which produces something in the unseen, and then the bringing of that unseen power into the world so that you can change it. The faith of the African is not one that is solely meditating on the final soul destination for the soul. Rather, it is on how to stay in constant communion and contact with the other side so that you can produce meaningful, valuable outcomes here. For the Rastafarian, it's the powerful argument, that what did Bob Marley say? Preacher, don't tell me that heaven, is above the earth. I know that you don't know what life is really worth, right? Don't keep talking to us about a God that's up in heaven and telling us not to pay attention to the suffering and the struggle down here. This metaphysics is about pulling from the power of that unseen space to effectuate change here. And it runs through Rastafarianism to Senegalese Sufi movements in ways that are clearly identifiable across space and across time, because there is a durable and lasting African ontological understanding. In other words, an understanding of what it means to be. And what it means to be, to actually exist, is to have your physical, material life tethered to your spiritual journey. So, the struggle, the commoditization, the brutalization of Black bodies across space and time. A people who have tapped spiritual and cultural resources to affirm their collective dignity in the face of that oppression. It's another excellent book on this called Rituals of Resistance by a historian named Jason Young. And what I learned from reading Jason Young's book, Rituals of Resistance, is that the African ritual tradition, which always has an artistic and creative element, whether it is through masking and dancing, whether it is through the griot's recitation of oral performance, it always has a cultural performance component. It is not simply a matter of personal piety. That's not how African religion works. It's collectively practiced with a cultural dimension that is multidisciplinary, that goes between our senses and between our forms of practice. So what Jason Young says, Dr. Jason Young says about these rituals is that ultimately the greatest form of resistance against systems that would dehumanize and commoditize human beings is to produce sound, healthy, whole, acculturated human beings. In other words, the rituals of initiation, the rituals associated with rites of passage, the rituals associated with marriage, the rituals associated with honoring the dead, all of these rituals that are about a connection with the unseen world are principally designed in order to make people into people, to say that you are not simply a brute beast that labors in a field, that you are a social being, you come from somewhere, you have ancestors, you have family, and you have a life that is beyond this one. These rituals produce humanity. So now to the cultural, we had the struggle, the spirituality, and finally to the art. One of the pieces, Remembrance, is probably the one I think of as most signal in this respect. Although, in response to your question, I'll change the order of presentation, and we'll talk about, what's the name of the piece? Yeah, no, it's Remembrance. The Remembrance is the Coltrane. So there's a piece back and to the left that is an enlarged album cover of John Coltrane's Love Supreme. You guys know this classic, this jazz classic. So what Jamal Cyrus has done, aside from sort of magnifying the scale and putting the beautiful red light behind it to frame it, and kind of capture the intensity of Coltrane on the cover, is that he's changed the title to Arabic letters. First spelled out John Coltrane in Arabic, and then written Allahu Akbar, God is the greatest, or God is supreme, as the album's title. He's expressing a well-known but not confirmed urban legend about John Coltrane, which is that John Coltrane had converted to Islam and wasn't public about his Muslim identity. Everyone that knows anything about that album will tell you that the original name of A Love Supreme was Allah Supreme. So Jamal has buried in the Arabic characters Allahu Akbar, Allah Supreme, to give expression to this virtuoso channel that was Coltrane. And that is precisely what the musician or the artist is, to bring together Sylvester Obechi's argument and mine, right? Is that the human being is this vessel through which an eruption from the unseen, from the place of inspiration, comes into being in the world. Whether it is through the instrument that that vessel holds in their hand, or the materials that they craft, the bricolage, the remix that they make. There are many nods to blues and to jazz, to the era of, Amiri Baraka back there, but this is a hip hop head exhibition, for sure. It's the constant juxtaposition and remixing that lets you know. The sensibility that is being expressed from piece to piece is not just that timeless narrative mode that I talked about as being something that is inherent in African narrative traditions, but it's something that's very specific to hip hop. It's a brother of my generation who grew up with music that was telling you about knowledge of self, that was pointing you back to Africa, that was pointing you to Malcolm X, that was pointing you to the Nation of Islam, that was pointing you to the 5%ers and the nations of gods and earths, that was including all of this cultural, nationalist, and Islamic reference. But it was doing it over cut-up records in disjointed fashion, discontinuous engagement, not creating the raw materials, but taking the raw materials of records that had already been made, catching just the part that you need, just that breakbeat, and making something wholly new out of the refuse that had been thrown away, out of records that had been put in crates, out of memories and histories that had been forgotten, about books that had been thrown away. Jet magazine torn into pieces in order to make a very specific kind of collage. The same great kings of Africa, Budweiser poster that I used to see in the liquor store next to my dad's locksmith shop in Northeast DC, Jamal Cyrus has brought that thing back, pulled it out of its context in order to make his own particular kind of commentary, not just on our culture, but on all of the ways in which it's been commercialized. Subtle, not even that subtle in this instance, satire. This is not blues people. It is about Blackness. It is about the blues. It is about the struggle, but this is a hip hop remix to blues people. It's in a different register, one which is not confined by discourse. This will be the second to last thing I'll say, because I'll conclude in a moment. My first book, The Walking Quran, Islamic Education, Embodied Knowledge and History in West Africa, is about how in Islamic West Africa, the people are the books. Texts don't hold any authority, human beings do. Guides will say things like, secrets are in the breasts of the liberated souls, not in the pages of books. One great early Muslim scholar put it this way. He said, knowing is a light that God casts into the breast of whosoever he wills. It is not the accumulation of many facts. Knowledge, culture, these are things that are embodied, expressed in this way, and transmitted in this way, not always or even not most of the time reduced to writing. They're transmitted from one living human being to another living human being. And the reason for this, and the reason why, to me, this kind of engagement is even richer than that of Baraka, is that they don't call it reducing it to writing for nothing. When you put pen to paper, you reduce an infinite number of experiential realities to a finite number of letters and words. The way that an embodied experience transmits to the senses at multiple levels cannot be reproduced with words. 99% of what human beings do and are things for which we have no words. I told you about my father's locksmith shop on 12th and H in Washington, D.C. My mother kidnapped us from his residence when I was about 7 years old because he was a serial drug abuser. We lived in a battered women's shelter for a little while after that, before being raised for most of the rest of my life by a single mother. So I didn't really know my father very well after age 7. But anyone that's ever met my father will tell you that every one of my hand gestures, every one of my vocal patterns, the way that I stand when I talk, that's all him. Well, why? Because for the first 7 years of my life, I was on the floor of his locksmith shop just about every day, watching everything that he did. He didn't tell me how to hold my hands. He didn't tell me to, like some dads will tell their kids, say it with your chest, put some bass in your voice. He didn't say those things. But you learn those things through mimesis, through being in the presence of somebody. Most of what we are, there are no words to express, nor could we write them down and transmit them to the next generation in words if we wanted to. No, instead, they have to be embodied. The power object, not just the word of power. The last thing that I'll say, to return to where we started with the struggle, and to return to the art of Jamal Cyrus, which you guys will check out in just a moment. Making people of widely varied backgrounds, experiences, regional cultures into a single people, that's really not fundamentally any different a task today than it was a couple hundred years ago during the time of the ring shop. Blackness still needs to be made and remade every day. What will constitute that culture for generations to come, and what that culture will say as its contribution to the universal history of humanity is still yet to be determined. In the Quran, which Jamal and I both read regularly, God says that he created people in different tongues and colors so that they would know one another. When one of the great West African scholars was making his commentary on this verse, his name is Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, he said that the meaning of to know in this sense is to love. God made human beings in different tongues and colors so that they would love one another. And then Sheikh Ibrahim Yas went on to say, how can a people that does not know itself love itself? And how can a people that doesn't love itself love anyone else? First, know yourself so that you can love yourself, so that you can love others. Back to Malcolm X, I promised I would bring it back to Malcolm. Malcolm was once famously said, the problem with the Negro is that if he sees a Negro selling ice and a white man selling ice, he's going to conclude that the white man's ice is colder. The problem that is deeply wired into black culture is a sense of inferiority, a sense of lacking, a sense that poverty, dispossession, the lack of a past, the lack of possessions leaves us as less than, an internalized self-hatred. This kind of cultural excavation, this kind of cultural celebration that straddles the line between the metaphysical and the material is a healing from that trauma. And it is the production, the ongoing production of the miracle that is blackness.
There's a moment when you said like ritual of resistance, and having that kind of makes healthy individuals.
Yeah. You said having what?
Having a ritual of resistance, or just having ritual in general, I think.
Yeah, is a form of resistance.
It's a form of resistance, but it leads to kind of like a healthy.
Yes.
And I wonder, are there moments where ritual goes awry? And because I think it's not just having the ritual per se, but like it's the ritual and something else. Because I'm thinking, Catholic Church, you have these rituals, but like thinking about, reading this book about the Igbo missionaries, or the missionaries and how they fucked over the Igbo, and those rituals did a number on us. But
Excellent distinction. So I hope that what I said, I'm playing back is I said that the best form of resistance to systems and people that are trying to dehumanize and commoditize our existence are rituals that make us fully human, right? So simply submitting, there are all kinds of rituals of dehumanization, right? Lynching is a ritual of dehumanization. That's the Floyd moment. That's a ritual. There's a reason why that is a very clearly intelligible exercise of power. We all know what that is. There's a reason why, those boys down in Georgia got federal hate crimes, because that was a lynching. We can all see it. It's a ritual that's been repeated and played out. I've never said all rituals are good. Do not quote me as having said that, because white supremacy has its rituals, right? But those rituals that make us fully human, those rituals that nourish our hearts and bodies and souls and spirits, that restore them to their sound state of health, those are the ones I'm talking about. Not the ones that are foisted upon us and that are utilized to brutalize. I'm just spitting bars all night. So, and I'll say just this, just to further reflect on, kind of your question. Never forget this as long as I live. I was sitting in one of my first African history classes after I went back to school after, being out of school for a while and working odd jobs and playing minor league baseball. And I was like, nah, I need to go ahead and see about these books. So I was back in school and taking an African history class, white professor. And I remember thinking, what's this white lady gonna teach me about African history? But she turned out to be amazing. One of the most kind of politically engaged, scholars I'd ever encountered. So she was giving a lecture on, Christianity in Africa. And my friend that was sitting next to me, turned to me and said, "What's your natural reaction when somebody forces something down your throat?" And I was like, "Huh?" And he said, "You spit that shit out." That was his summary of how, to deal with Christianity that is imposed in this way. Rituals that are forced upon us, spit that out. Don't internalize those categories. Don't swallow that. Now, as it happens, there are numerous African Christian communities that don't do that, right? Ethiopians don't have Christianity, foisted upon them. They embrace that before the Holy Roman Empire does. The kings of Congo don't have Christianity enforced upon them. They accept Christianity voluntarily when there's a handful of Capuchin priests in the Congo in the 1500s, and it becomes Congolese Christianity. For the ancestors of the Cape-colored population in South Africa, the Khoikhoi population, they are preaching against their Dutch masters as having violated the basic teachings of Christ. Christianity becomes a radical tool in their hands, but only when it's used, for these humanizing and liberating efforts. When it's used to bring people into bondage, which is, one of the principal functions of religion these days. Let's be honest about that. Then spit that shit out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Would you be able to offer your thoughts on going back to the struggle and the surrender, and that using that metaphor of like spitting it out, like the struggle, like when it is yours, taking it in and like surrendering to, like I think about like all the like outside of like what is in your control, like the metabolizing of like, you know, like the things in your stomach, the other organisms, like, and extending that to like, you know, the spiritual, like, does it take a shake? Does it take a shake to get us out of that?
Okay, so yes, there's two levels at which I want to answer this. So the first, we'll go back to Malcolm, right? And the engagement that Jamal takes with Malcolm. Everybody that was around Malcolm on that day in the before the Audubon Ballroom talk said that Malcolm knew that he was going to die that day. Right? People that were normally with him, he asked them not to be with him because he didn't want them to suffer the harm that he thought was coming to him. In the Sufi teaching of Muslims in West Africa, this is the concept that's referred to in the Quran as taslim, acceptance. When your fate, such as it is inevitable, you accept it. Insofar as it is rooted in belief that no good or ill reaches the human being except that its ultimate provenance is God. Even the evil that is done to you by other human beings is encompassed by a good, graceful, and merciful plan from the Almighty. This is the most difficult thing for human souls to accept because we are always 100% sure that our plan for our lives is better than God's plan for our life. The same teacher that I mentioned, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, spoke about this, or rather wrote about it in a letter to a disciple once. And he said, I have been accused of witchcraft, heresy, thrown out of my family. He said, I have been subjected to insults that my pen refuses to record. But I've come to understand that my enemies are capable neither of harm nor of benefit. Everything everything that God wills comes to pass, and what God wills is invariably for the best. He has protected me from the wickedness of my enemies, and he will deliver to me his victory. The thing that is rooting this approach is two fundamental things. At an internal level, accept everything that you experience as a word from God. And then with everything that you have in your being, you struggle to rectify affairs in the world and bring justice. But in the end, man proposes, God disposes. Now, with respect to your second question, do we need a sheikh? Do we need a teacher? Do we need a spiritual guide? The unequivocal answer from the Islamic African tradition is yes. No human being can ever convince themselves to accept any of the propositions that I just gave you because our egos are incapable of submitting. Our egos are incapable of accepting that there would be a power higher than them that they would have to yield to. The term for the ego in the Metaphysics of the Spiritual Teachers is the nafs, which literally means the lower soul, but it also means the self. And there's an African saying that summarizes this, why every person needs a guide along the road, is that even the sharpest knife can't carve its own handle. If you are the instrument that's broken, how can you use yourself to fix you? From that standpoint, the entire self-help complex associated with kind of modern pop psychology is utterly absurd. It's a journey entirely inside of the ego that can never get you out of the prison of your own ego. It will just reinforce your ego's predilections at various stages along the way. Whereas somebody that is an experienced guide that had gone through this process themselves, will easily recognize what kind of, spiritual practices are going to be most beneficial for the sublimation of your ego at any point in time. Yeah, go ahead. No, please.
Okay, so thinking about that, like, what about like a schema like C.G. Jung's Red Book, or like the process of individuation, like that kind of collective unconscious sort of thing? Like,
I don't know CGM's Red Book. But you said the individuated self-conscious, huh?
This idea of like maybe like the process of making what is not conscious, but then also tying it to like the collective, like sort of like energy source of the human condition.
Okay. So one of the great spiritual teachers in the Islamic tradition, not in this case West African, North African, but he's the Sheikh of Sheikh Ibrahim Yas. So this is Ahmed Tijani, the founder of the Tijani Tariqa. He said, that the greatest form of disbelief is thinking that your own individuated nafs is a real thing. He refers back to the verse in Surah Luqman in the Quran that says of humanity, he said, your creation and your resurrection is as none other than that of a single soul. The truth is that our spiritual lives and our material lives are all interconnected. There is nothing that we do in our physical or metaphysical realms that is without impact on our fellow human being. This is expressed in the very narration of the Quranic creation of the human being, where the ruh, God's own divine breath, is breathed into the frame of Adam and therefore shared by humanity for all of the rest of time. We are all connected. And that's ultimately the reason why what sounds like a kind of philosophy of resignation before the divine will isn't. When you understand human beings as breaths of divinity, then any harm that you see befalling a human being, it's imperative for you to take whatever action you can to redress it. It's the reason why time and time again, and this couldn't be the subject of the talk today, but in the African Islamic tradition, you find the pairing of spirituality and social justice in systematic fashion. Never one without the other. Never one without the other. These are always tethered. I'll give you the perfect example alongside, Malcolm is Martin, right? Activists have been copying the techniques and strategies of the American civil rights movement for 60 years, 70 years, with frankly very little success. I'm just going to be blunt about that. Nonviolent resistance had been theorized by Thoreau and other folks in Western societies. Gandhi had used it with great success. King used it with great. There's no magic in those techniques. I hate to break it to you. What was magic was the production of a transcendent narrative about the redemption of human souls, both of the oppressed and of the oppressor. That is what made King powerful. That's what made Gandhi powerful, is that they told a sacred story about our shared origin and shared destiny that allowed us to return, or try to return, to who we really are. So all of that's just to say that the first thing that has to happen, unfortunately, and this is systematic, is that the nafs has to be broken. The ego has to be broken. It has to, because the Sufi theorists are clear on this, is that the sin of the ego is the sin of Pharaoh in the Quran. Pharaoh says, I'm your Lord God Most High, worship none but me. And that is the role of the ego inside the human being. Wasn't expecting to do Sufi metaphysics, but hey. Happy, always happy is my favorite subject. Ask my wife, she'll tell you she has to hear about that all the time.
Well, why don't we spend some time in the exhibition?
I would love that, yeah.
Whoever has time.
You guys ready to
Thank
check out
you
the,
so much.
the pieces?